The victory that was and wasn't May 9th, 1942, 0730 hours. Imperial Japanese Navy, Combined Fleet Headquarters, Hashirajima Anchorage. Commander Yasuji Watanabe, Intelligence Officer to Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, spread the decoded wireless reports across his desk with hands that trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from exhaustion and something approaching elation. The Americans had lost a fleet carrier. USS Lexington, 33,000 tons of American naval power, now rested on the bottom of the Coral Sea alongside the destroyers Sims and the oiler Neosho. Against this, Japan had lost only the light carrier Shoho, a vessel of less than half Lexington's displacement. The mathematics seemed clear, the conclusion obvious. "We have won," Watanabe whispered to himself, making a notation in his log. What he didn't know was that in the folders stacked beside him lay the evidence of something far more consequential than the ships at the bottom of the sea. A truth that would reshape the entire trajectory of the Pacific War. The reports continued to arrive throughout the morning. Shokaku had taken 2 bomb hits, but was steaming home under her own power. Zuikaku remained undamaged, her aircraft losses minimal. The American task force had withdrawn. Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue's Operation MO Force had accomplished its primary objective of preventing an American interference with the planned invasion of Port Moresby, even if the invasion itself had been temporarily postponed. Every metric that Watanabe had been trained to evaluate pointed to the same conclusion. Japan had traded favorable, inflicted greater losses than sustained, and maintained control of the tactical situation. But there was something in Admiral Yamamoto's face when Watanabe delivered his preliminary assessment that gave him pause. The Admiral listened in silence, nodded once, then turned to gaze out at the gray waters of the inland sea. "Prepare a complete analysis," Yamamoto said quietly. "I want to know the operational status of every carrier, the readiness of every air group, and the timeline for the next phase of operations. Everything, Watanabe-san. Leave nothing out." It was an unusual request for what appeared to be a clear-cut victory. What Watanabe would discover over the following weeks would transform his understanding not just of the Battle of Coral Sea, but of the entire nature of carrier warfare itself. The mathematics were staggering, but not in the way they first appeared. The Battle of Coral Sea had been the first naval engagement in history where surface ships never exchanged fire, where the entire battle was fought by aircraft operating hundreds of miles from their parent carriers. In this new paradigm, the relevant metrics were not tonnage sunk, but rather operational capability, preserved or lost. The American Pacific Fleet had entered the battle with 3 fleet carriers available for operations: Lexington, Yorktown, and Enterprise. They had lost one, a loss rate of 33%. But Japan's combined fleet, with 10 carriers theoretically available across all theaters, had effectively lost the use of 2 of its most capable fleet carriers, just as the decisive phase of the Pacific campaign was about to begin. Shokaku would require 2 months of repair. Zuikaku, though undamaged, had lost so many experienced aircrew that she could not operate effectively without replacement pilots, a process that would take equally long. The 5th Carrier Division, the most powerful carrier striking force in the Imperial Navy, comprising both Shokaku and Zuikaku, would be unavailable for Operation MI, the planned assault on Midway Atoll, scheduled for early June. The true scale became apparent only when Watanabe compiled the operational readiness reports. For Operation MI, Yamamoto had planned to deploy 6 fleet carriers, the largest concentration of carrier striking power ever assembled by any nation. With the 5th Carrier Division unavailable, that number dropped to 4: Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu. The Americans, despite losing Lexington, would be able to field 3 carriers at Midway, Once Yorktown's repairs were rushed through at Pearl Harbor, a process that would take just 3 days instead of the estimated 3 months. The ratio of Japanese to American carrier strength, which should have been 6-2 or 6-3, would instead be 4-3. In carrier warfare, where the side that struck first typically won decisively, this margin was far thinner than Japanese planning had anticipated. What had seemed like a favorable exchange at Coral Sea, one American fleet carrier for one Japanese light carrier, had actually resulted in a near equalization of carrier forces at the most critical juncture of the Pacific War. To understand how Watanabe and the combined fleet staff had initially misread the situation requires understanding the world in which they operated, the assumptions that shaped their analysis. The Imperial Japanese Navy had spent 2 decades developing carrier doctrine based on the principle of concentrated striking power. The First Air Fleet, under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, represented the apotheosis of this thinking. 6 fleet carriers operating as a unified force, capable of launching strike packages of over 200 aircraft. This concentration had achieved stunning success at Pearl Harbor, where over 300 Japanese aircraft had struck the American Pacific Fleet at anchor, sinking or damaging 8 battleships and destroying nearly 200 aircraft on the ground. The operation had cost Japan only 29 aircraft, a loss rate of less than 10%. In the 6 months since Pearl Harbor, the First Air Fleet had ranged across the Pacific and into the Indian Ocean, supporting amphibious operations in the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. Japanese carriers had raided Darwin, Australia, and Ceylon, sinking the British carrier, Hermes, and 2 heavy cruisers. In every engagement, the principle held. Concentrated carrier striking power, used decisively, could overwhelm any defense. The American carriers, operating singly or in pairs, had been unable to seriously challenge this dominance. The raids they conducted, hitting Japanese positions in the Marshall Islands and at Marcus Island, were pinpricks, achieving little strategic effect while demonstrating that the Americans lacked both the numbers and the doctrine to contest Japanese control of the Western Pacific. Watanabe himself had participated in the planning for Operation MO, the seizure of Port Moresby and Tulagi. The operation was conceived as supporting action, necessary to secure the southern flank before the main effort against Midway Atoll. Most of the combined fleet's carrier strength was being husbanded for Operation MI, which would draw the American carriers into a decisive battle that would destroy them. Operation MO would be supported by a smaller carrier force, adequate for the limited opposition expected. Vice Admiral Inoue had been given Shokaku and Zuikaku, 2 of Japan's newest and most capable fleet carriers, plus the light carrier Shoho. Against this, intelligence suggested the Americans might deploy 1, perhaps 2 carriers. The force ratio seemed entirely adequate. The assumption that guided all planning was that Japanese naval aviation remained qualitatively superior, that Japanese pilots were better trained, that Japanese aircraft were more capable, that Japanese tactics were more sophisticated. 6 months of unbroken victory had done nothing to challenge these assumptions. When the battle began on May 3rd, with the Japanese landing at Tulagi, everything seemed to proceed according to plan. The American carrier raids on the landing force at Tulagi on May 4th were ineffective, causing minimal damage while expending nearly 70 American sorties. Japanese losses were trivial. 1 destroyer damaged, 3 minesweepers sunk. The exchange rate seemed to validate the superiority of Japanese forces. What no one on Inoue's staff fully appreciated was that Admiral Frank Fletcher's strike at Tulagi had achieved its primary objective, not in the ships it sank, but in the intelligence it provided. Confirmation that Japanese carriers were operating in the region, information about their probable operating areas, and critical experience for American aviators who had never before attacked ships under realistic combat conditions. The first revelation came not during the battle itself, but in its immediate aftermath. When the operational reports began arriving at Combined Fleet headquarters, Watanabe was compiling the aircraft loss data when he noticed something that didn't match his expectations. The Americans had lost 66 aircraft during the 2 days of battle. Japan had lost 77. He checked the figures again, thinking he must have made an error in transcription. The American losses included 43 aircraft lost in the strike against Shokaku on May 8th, plus various fighters and reconnaissance aircraft lost in other engagements. But Japanese losses were even higher. All of Shoho's aircraft, plus 37 aircraft from Shokaku and Zuikaku, lost in combat, crashes, and operational accidents. In the 6 previous months of combat, Japanese naval aviation had consistently achieved favorable loss rates, typically shooting down 3 or 4 American aircraft for every Japanese aircraft lost. At Coral Sea, the exchange rate had been nearly even. For the first time since the war began, American carrier pilots had fought Japanese carrier pilots to something approaching a draw. The personnel losses told an even more concerning story. Lieutenant Commander Takahisa Amagai, Air Operations Officer for the 5th Carrier Division, compiled the casualty lists with growing unease. 53 naval aviators killed or missing. These were not replaceable assets. Each carrier pilot required 2 years of training, accumulating hundreds of hours of flight time before being rated combat ready. Japan's aviation training programs, designed for peacetime expansion rates, were producing approximately 250 new pilots per year across all categories. The combined fleet required at least 350 pilots per year to maintain full strength in wartime, accounting for combat losses, operational accidents, and the expansion of air groups as new carriers entered service. The deficit was small enough to be manageable in the short term, Amagai calculated, but only if loss rates remained consistent with pre-Coral Sea experience. If future battles produced pilot losses at the Coral Sea rate, the training pipeline would not keep pace. Amagai brought his analysis to Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, who commanded the 5th Carrier Division's cruiser screen and was preparing to take command of the division itself. Ozawa read through the figures twice, then looked up at Amagai with an expression the younger officer couldn't quite interpret. "And Zuikaku's air group?" Ozawa asked. "Zuikaku is undamaged," Amagai confirmed. "But her air group lost 21 aircraft at Coral Sea. The pilots who survived are experienced, among our best. But we cannot reconstitute the full air group in less than 6 weeks, and that assumes we have trained replacements available. We do not. The latest class from Tsuchiura does not graduate until late June." Ozawa was silent for a long moment. "So, Zuikaku cannot participate in Operation MI?" It was phrased as a question, but both men understood it as a statement of fact. "No, sir. Not at full capability." The pattern emerged more clearly when Watanabe began comparing the tactical conduct of the battle to pre-war planning assumptions. Japanese doctrine held that the side which achieved surprise and struck first would win the carrier battle decisively. The doctrine assumed that a well-coordinated strike by a full carrier air group could sink or cripple an enemy carrier before it could launch a counterstrike. This had proven true at Pearl Harbor and in the sinking of HMS Hermes in the Indian Ocean. But at Coral Sea, both sides had launched strikes at approximately the same time on May 8th. Both sides' aircraft had found their targets. Both sides had inflicted damage. But neither side had achieved the decisive first strike that doctrine predicted would be possible. More troubling was the accuracy of Japanese bombing. The strike against USS Yorktown on May 8th had involved 69 aircraft, including 18 torpedo bombers carrying the Type 91 torpedo, the most advanced aerial torpedo in the world. and 51 dive bombers carrying bombs ranging from 250 kilograms to 800 kilograms. This massive strike had achieved just 3 hits on Yorktown, 2 bombs and 1 torpedo, causing serious but not fatal damage. The strike against Lexington had been more successful, achieving 2 torpedo hits and at least 3 bomb hits. But Lexington had continued operating for several hours before internal explosions from leaked aviation gasoline caused her to be abandoned. In both cases, the damage had been far less than doctrine predicted. American carrier construction, with multiple compartments and sophisticated damage control systems, had proven more resilient than Japanese planning assumed. Lieutenant Toshio Hashimoto, a dive bomber pilot from Zuikaku, who had participated in the strike against Yorktown, tried to explain the difficulty to the intelligence officers who debriefed him. The American ships were maneuvering radically, Hashimoto said, his voice still hoarse from hours of shouting over engine noise and intercom static. I have made over 300 practice dives against maneuvering targets, but never against a target maneuvering so violently. Yorktown was making at least 30 knots, turning continuously. Her anti-aircraft fire was far heavier than we anticipated. I saw at least 6 of our aircraft shot down before they could release their weapons. The ones that did release, many of their bombs missed. I achieved a near miss, perhaps 10 meters from the ship's side. Under other circumstances, it might have caused damage. Against Yorktown's hull strength, it accomplished nothing. Other pilots told similar stories. The coordination between torpedo bombers and dive bombers, so carefully practiced in training, had broken down in the face of American defensive fire and maneuvering. Torpedo bombers needed to approach from multiple angles simultaneously to overwhelm the target's ability to evade. But American fighters had disrupted the Japanese formations before they could coordinate their attacks. Dive bombers needed clear visibility and steady nerves to achieve hits. But the dense anti-aircraft fire, far heavier than Japanese intelligence had predicted, had forced pilots to release early and high, sacrificing accuracy for survival. Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki, who had led the strike against Yorktown, reported that the American Combat Air Patrol had been unexpectedly aggressive and effective, shooting down several Japanese aircraft before they could begin their attack runs. The scale of the strategic implications became clear only when Operation MI, the Midway operation, entered its final planning stages in late May. Watanabe was present at the staff conference when Admiral Yamamoto's Chief of Staff, Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki, presented the final order of battle for Operation MI. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, Soryu, against an expected American force of 2, perhaps 3 carriers. Ugaki presented the plan with confidence, noting that the 4-2 or 4-3 advantage was adequate for decisive victory, especially given Japanese superiority in pilot training and tactical execution. But Watanabe, who had spent the previous 3 weeks analyzing the Coral Sea engagement, felt a growing unease that he struggled to articulate. The plan assumed that Japanese carriers would achieve surprise, that they would detect American carriers before being detected, that the Japanese strike would achieve the kind of devastating first blow that had been successful at Pearl Harbor, but had failed at Coral Sea. Every assumption in the operational plan rested on a foundation of Japanese superiority that Coral Sea had called into question. But Watanabe was a junior officer, and these were admirals and captains with decades of experience. Who was he to question the wisdom of the combined fleet staff? He stayed silent during the conference, making notes, tabulating the force ratios, checking the logistics schedules. It was only later, lying in his bunk in the early hours of morning, that he allowed himself to think the unthinkable. What if the assumptions are wrong? What if Coral Sea was not an anomaly, but a harbinger? Commander Minoru Genda, Air Operations Officer for the 1st Air Fleet, did not suffer from Watanabe's junior officer reticence. Genda had planned the Pearl Harbor attack and was widely regarded as the Imperial Navy's most innovative tactical thinker. When he saw the final plan for Midway, he immediately requested a conference with Vice Admiral Nagumo. "The absence of the 5th Carrier Division creates an unacceptable risk," Genda told Nagumo bluntly. "We are going into battle with 4 carriers when our plan assumed 6. If the Americans deploy 3 carriers, as intelligence suggests, we lose the margin of superiority necessary for decisive action. Coral Sea demonstrated that American carriers are more difficult to sink than we assumed. American pilots are more capable than we believed. American doctrine is more sophisticated than our intelligence indicated. We should postpone Operation MI until Shokaku and Zuikaku are available." Nagumo listened with the patience of a man who had heard these concerns before and had already made his decision. "The decision to proceed with Operation MI on schedule was made by Admiral Yamamoto himself," Nagumo replied. "The operation cannot be postponed. The diplomatic situation requires action. The American carrier force must be brought to battle and destroyed. 4 carriers are adequate for this purpose." Genda wanted to argue further, but recognized the futility. The decision had been made at a level far above either of them. He returned to his planning duties with a sense of foreboding that he confided only to his diary. "We are going to battle with one hand tied behind our back, and we are facing an enemy we no longer fully understand." The human dimension of this strategic miscalculation became apparent through the letters and diaries of pilots who fought at both Coral Sea and 5 weeks later at Midway. Petty Officer First Class Takeshi Maeda, a carrier pilot from Hiryu, wrote to his brother after Coral Sea with an observation that would prove prophetic. The American pilots fought differently than at Pearl Harbor. They were aggressive, pressing their attacks despite losses. Their torpedo bomber pilots especially, flying those obsolete devastators, coming in low and slow where our fighters and anti-aircraft fire could massacre them, knowing they would probably die, but coming anyway. At Tulagi, at Coral Sea, I shot down 2 of them. Both times the pilot could have turned away, dropped his torpedo from long range, saved himself. Neither did. They came straight in, focused entirely on their target, ignoring my aircraft until I shot them down. This is not the behavior of a defeated enemy. This is the behavior of an enemy who believes he will ultimately win. Maeda's observation was not unique. Multiple Japanese pilots noted the increasing effectiveness of American fighter tactics at Coral Sea. The American F-4F Wildcat fighter was slower and less maneuverable than the Japanese Zero. But American pilots had learned to avoid dogfighting, instead using tactics that emphasized the Wildcat's superior diving speed and rugged construction. Lieutenant Saburo Shindo, a Zero pilot from Zuikaku, described an engagement over the American carriers on May 8th that left him shaken. "The American fighters did not attempt to turn with us. Instead, they made high-speed diving passes, fired a burst, then dove away before we could engage. Our advantage in turning radius was useless. One of their pilots made 3 such passes at my section, each time he hit one of our aircraft. 2 of my wingmen were shot down. I never had a clear shot at him. When I tried to pursue, he simply dove away at speeds we could not match. This is a new American tactic. We have no counter for it." The psychological impact of Coral Sea on Japanese naval aviators was subtle but significant. For 6 months, they had been victorious in every engagement, had faced enemies who seemed bewildered by Japanese capabilities, who fought bravely but ineffectively. At Coral Sea, the enemy had been different. The Americans had found the Japanese carriers despite elaborate deception measures. They had pressed home attacks through devastating defensive fire. They had sunk Shoho in a matter of minutes with a coordinated strike that demonstrated tactical proficiency approaching Japanese standards. And they had withdrawn at the end, not in defeat, but in good order, preserving their remaining carrier to fight another day. These were not the actions of an inferior force stumbling toward inevitable defeat. These were the actions of a competent enemy, learning from experience and adapting rapidly. The contrast between Japanese and American post-battle analysis revealed fundamentally different organizational cultures. The Imperial Navy's evaluation of Coral Sea, circulated to operational units in late May, emphasized the tactical victory. One American fleet carrier sunk, one damaged, against the loss of one light carrier. The report noted the temporary unavailability of Shokaku and Zuikaku, but characterized this as a minor setback that would be resolved within weeks. The report concluded that Operation MO had successfully prevented the American interference with Japanese strategic objectives in the Southwest Pacific. Missing from this analysis was any serious examination of why the battle had not achieved the decisive result that doctrine predicted, why Japanese aircraft losses had been so high, why American carriers had proven so difficult to sink. The Americans, by contrast, conducted an exhaustive analysis of every aspect of Coral Sea, from fleet positioning to fighter direction to bombing accuracy. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Fleet, personally reviewed reports from every squadron commander who had participated in the battle. Fighter tactics were revised based on the observed effectiveness of hit-and-run attacks against Zeros. Torpedo bomber doctrine was modified to emphasize coordination with dive bombers. Damage control procedures were examined and improved. The loss of Lexington was treated not as a defeat, but as a learning opportunity, with detailed studies of how aviation gasoline vapor had accumulated in the ship's interior and caused the fatal explosions. Changes were implemented across the fleet within days. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort, whose cryptanalysis team at Station HIPO in Pearl Harbor had provided the intelligence that enabled the American fleet to intercept the Japanese at Coral Sea, immediately turned his attention to the next Japanese operation. His team had identified the designator AF in Japanese radio traffic and had tentatively identified it as Midway Atoll. In the wake of Coral Sea, Nimitz gave Rochefort resources to confirm this identification and determine the timing and scale of the Japanese operation. Within 2 weeks, Rochefort's team had broken enough of the Japanese naval code to provide Nimitz with detailed information about Operation MI, including the number of carriers, the planned date of attack, and the composition of the invasion force. This intelligence coup, made possible by the confidence Nimitz had gained in Rochefort's analysis after Coral Sea, would prove decisive at Midway. The progressive revelations continued throughout May, as various participants in Coral Sea began to understand the battle's true significance. Captain Frederick Sherman, who had commanded Lexington, filed a report that included a detailed analysis of the damage his ship had sustained and the measures that might have saved her. His conclusion was startling. Lexington had survived the initial Japanese attack and might have survived to return to Pearl Harbor if not for the gasoline vapor explosions that occurred hours after the battle. The Japanese attack had been successful, but not overwhelmingly so. With better damage control procedures, particularly regarding aviation gasoline vapor management, American carriers could sustain substantial damage and remain operational. Sherman's report circulated throughout the Pacific Fleet, changing assumptions about carrier survivability and leading to immediate modifications in damage control doctrine. On the Japanese side, the implications were being grasped by a few perceptive officers, but not being reflected in official planning. Commander Tamechi Hara, who commanded the destroyer Amatsukaze in the screening force for Shokaku and Zuikaku, wrote in his diary on May 23rd, "We are told that Coral Sea was a victory. By the measure of tonnage sunk, this is true. But by the measure that matters, operational capability, we lost. The Americans sacrificed one carrier but retained two in operational status. We lost the effective use of two carriers just as the decisive battle approaches. The Americans learned from the engagement and are adapting their tactics. We are declaring victory and learning nothing. I fear for what will happen at Midway. Hara's fears were shared by others, but rarely voiced openly. The Imperial Navy's culture emphasized fighting spirit and offensive action, not cautious analysis and systematic learning. To question whether Coral Sea was truly a victory, to suggest that American capabilities had been underestimated, to propose that Japanese doctrine might be flawed. These were not career-enhancing positions for mid-level officers to take. And so the concerns remained private, confined to diaries and letters. While the official analysis proclaimed triumph and the combined fleet steamed toward Midway with a 4-carrier force that should have been 6. The paradigm fully shattered, not at Coral Sea itself, but at Midway on June 4, 1942, when the consequences of Coral Sea became undeniably clear. The 4 Japanese carriers of the First Air Fleet were caught with their decks crowded with aircraft, being rearmed for a second strike against Midway's airbase, when American dive bombers arrived overhead. In the span of 6 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were transformed into burning wrecks by American bombs. Hiryu survived long enough to launch a strike that badly damaged USS Yorktown, but was herself sunk by American aircraft later that afternoon. In one day, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers and over 200 aircraft. The Americans lost 1 carrier, Yorktown, already damaged at Coral Sea and hastily repaired. The strategic balance in the Pacific shifted decisively in favor of the United States. In the aftermath of Midway, the absence of Shokaku and Zuikaku became the subject of intense and bitter analysis within the combined fleet staff. If the 5th Carrier Division had been available, the First Air Fleet would have had 6 carriers instead of 4. The additional aircraft would have provided more search assets, increasing the probability of locating the American carriers earlier. The additional striking power might have enabled a second attack wave against the American fleet, destroying all 3 American carriers instead of just damaging Yorktown. The additional fighters might have prevented the American dive bombers from achieving surprise. Every aspect of the Midway disaster might have been different if the 5th Carrier Division had been present. Commander Watanabe, in a report that was suppressed but later preserved in his personal papers, wrote with remarkable candor, "The Battle of Coral Sea was proclaimed a victory because we sank more tonnage than we lost. By this measure, we won. But this is not the correct measure for carrier warfare. The correct measure is operational capability maintained or lost. By this measure, we lost at Coral Sea. We traded the temporary neutralization of 1 American carrier for the extended unavailability of 2 of our own. This trade was acceptable only if we faced no immediate need for maximum carrier strength. But we did face such a need. Operation MI was scheduled for 4 weeks after Coral Sea. We needed every available carrier. The decision to risk our most capable carrier division in a supporting operation, Operation MO, while husbanding less capable units for the main effort, Operation MI, was a fundamental error in strategic prioritization. We fought the wrong battle with our best assets, then fought the decisive battle without them. Rear Admiral Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, came to similar conclusions but expressed them less diplomatically. In his diary entry for June 10, 1942, 6 days after the Midway disaster, Ugaki wrote, "The operational plan for MO and MI was flawed from the beginning. We should have concentrated all available carrier strength for MI, the decisive operation. Instead, we dispersed our forces, sent our two best carriers to MO where they suffered damage and pilot losses that rendered them unavailable for MI. Vice Admiral Inoue must bear responsibility for not prosecuting Operation MO more aggressively. His failure to destroy the American carrier force at Coral Sea when he had the opportunity was a significant operational failure. But the larger blame lies with the staff, including myself, who approved a plan that divided our carrier strength at the moment when concentration was most critical. The human cost of these strategic miscalculations became clear in the months following Midway. Of the approximately 350 pilots who had fought at Coral Sea on the Japanese side, over 150 were dead or missing by August 1942, killed at Midway or in subsequent operations. The Imperial Navy's pilot training program, already stretched thin, could not replace experienced carrier pilots at the rate they were being lost. By late 1942, Japanese carrier air groups were being filled out with newly graduated pilots who had less than half the training hours of the men they replaced. American pilots, meanwhile, were benefiting from a massive expansion in training infrastructure. With training pipelines that would produce over 8,000 new naval aviators in 1943 alone, a number that exceeded Japan's entire naval aviation pilot corps at the start of the war. Lieutenant Commander Shimazaki, who had led the strike against Yorktown at Coral Sea and had survived Midway, was killed at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August 1942. Lieutenant Hashimoto died at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands in October 1942. Petty Officer Maeda was shot down over Guadalcanal in November 1942. Of the air group commanders who had led squadrons at Coral Sea, fewer than 20% survived the war. Many of them recorded, in letters home or in testimony given after the war, a sense that Coral Sea had been the turning point, the moment when the Americans stopped retreating and began learning how to fight. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and who was aboard Akagi at Midway, wrote in his post-war memoir, "At Coral Sea, we believed we had won because we sank a carrier. We did not understand that we had actually lost because we had failed to destroy the American carrier force while suffering losses that compromised our ability to fight the next battle." This failure to understand the true nature of carrier warfare, to grasp that operational availability mattered more than simple tonnage equations, cost us the victory at Midway and perhaps cost us the war. We were still thinking in terms of battleship warfare, where sinking more tonnage than you lose represents victory. Carrier warfare is different. In carrier warfare, victory goes to the side that can maintain operational capability, that can keep its carriers at sea and its air groups at fighting strength. The Americans understood this after Coral Sea. We did not. The broader context that made the Battle of Coral Sea so consequential lay in the differential industrial and training capacities of the combatants. The United States entered the war with 7 fleet carriers. Japan had 10. The ratio seemed manageable from the Japanese perspective. But by 1944, the United States had 27 fleet carriers in service, with another 50 light carriers and escort carriers. Japan managed to commission 6 additional fleet carriers during the war, and of these, 4 were sunk before becoming operational. The disparity was not simply in numbers, but in the entire industrial and educational infrastructure that supported carrier operations. American shipyards in 1942 produced over 100,000 tons of carrier displacement, equal to 3 Essex-class fleet carriers. Japanese shipyards produced approximately 30,000 tons of carrier displacement. The gap would only widen. American pilot training programs in 1942 graduated 5,200 naval aviators. Japanese programs graduated approximately 900. American industry produced over 40,000 aircraft in 1942, of which nearly 8,000 were naval aircraft. Japan produced approximately 8,000 aircraft total, of which roughly 3,000 were naval aircraft, in every category: production, training, logistics. The United States held a multiple-fold advantage that would only grow larger as the war continued. This meant that every Japanese carrier lost, every experienced pilot killed, every month that a damaged carrier spent under repair represented an irreplaceable loss to Japanese operational capability. The Americans, conversely, could absorb losses and rapidly reconstitute their forces with new ships and new pilots. At Coral Sea, Japan had effectively traded 2 carriers for 1 on an availability basis, Shokaku and Zuikaku becoming unavailable in exchange for Lexington being sunk. This seemed acceptable in isolation. But in the context of the larger industrial balance, it was a disastrous trade. The Americans could replace Lexington's capabilities within months, either through new construction or through the rapid repair of damaged ships. Japan could not accelerate the repairs to Shokaku or the reconstitution of Zuikaku's air group. The time required was the time required, and during that time, Japan's carrier striking power was diminished by exactly the margin that proved critical at Midway. The ending came not with a dramatic revelation, but with the slow accumulation of understanding among those who had lived through the events. For Commander Watanabe, the transformation was complete by the end of June 1942. He had begun the month believing that Coral Sea represented a Japanese tactical victory that had accomplished its strategic objective of preventing American interference with Operation MO. He ended the month understanding that Coral Sea had been the first American strategic victory of the Pacific War, a battle in which the Americans had sacrificed tactical advantage, the loss of Lexington, to gain strategic position, the preservation of operational capability at the critical moment. The mathematics that had seemed so favorable on May 9th. 1 American carrier sunk against 1 light Japanese carrier lost, had been rendered meaningless by June 4th when the consequences played out at Midway. Watanabe sat in his small office at Hashirajima on the evening of June 15, 1942, composing a letter to his father that he knew would never pass the censor, and which he would therefore never send. "We declared Coral Sea a victory," he wrote, "and in the narrowest sense, we were right. We sank more ships than we lost. But we were thinking like battleship admirals while fighting a carrier war. In carrier warfare, the side that maintains operational capability wins, regardless of tonnage ratios." The Americans understood this. They withdrew after Coral Sea not because they were defeated, but because they had achieved their objective. They had prevented us from taking Port Moresby. They had preserved their carrier striking force, and they had learned how to fight us effectively. We understood none of this. We celebrated a victory that was actually a defeat, and we went to Midway, unprepared for the enemy we faced. Every carrier that burned at Midway, every pilot who died, their fate was sealed at Coral Sea, when we failed to understand the true nature of the battle we had fought. The reunion moment came decades later, in 1972, when a group of American and Japanese veterans of Coral Sea gathered in Tokyo for a conference on the battle. Among them was Rear Admiral Sherman, retired, who had commanded Lexington. Also present was Vice Admiral Ugaki's former deputy, a captain named Hiroshi Suzuki, who had participated in the post-battle analysis. The 2 men found themselves in conversation during a reception, comparing notes on their respective understandings of the battle. "We were devastated when Lexington went down," Sherman admitted. "A carrier sunk, over 200 men lost. It seemed like a terrible defeat." Suzuki nodded slowly. "And we celebrated when we heard the news. A fleet carrier sunk. Only a light carrier lost." It seemed like a great victory. The two men were silent for a moment. But you preserved Yorktown and Enterprise, Suzuki continued. You kept them operational. You had them available for Midway. We lost the use of Shokaku and Zuikaku. They were not available for Midway. In the end, this made all the difference. Sherman considered this. I didn't understand it at the time, he said. I was focused on saving my crew, on the immediate crisis. It was only later, after Midway, that I began to understand what Coral Sea had actually accomplished. We had stopped your advance. We had bloodied your carrier air groups. We had learned how to fight carrier battles. The price was high, but in retrospect, it was worth paying. Suzuki smiled sadly. And we learned nothing from Coral Sea. We declared victory and moved on to Midway with the same assumptions, the same doctrine, and 2 fewer carriers. Perhaps if we had understood what you understood, the outcome would have been different. But we were winning, and winning men do not question their methods. The final irony of the Battle of Coral Sea was that what appeared to contemporaries as a clear tactical victory for Japan was actually the moment when the strategic initiative in the Pacific War began to shift to the United States. The Japanese had sunk more tonnage, had inflicted greater immediate losses, had claimed victory in their official communiques. But they had lost something more important, the ability to operate at will without serious opposition. They had lost the confidence that their carrier air groups were invincible. They had lost the operational availability of their most capable carriers at the moment when that availability would prove decisive. And they had given the Americans invaluable experience and confidence. Lessons that would be applied at Midway 1 month later with devastating effect. The ships that fought at Coral Sea are long gone now. Lexington rests on the ocean floor in the Coral Sea, 1,500 fathoms down, discovered by underwater exploration teams in 2018. Shokaku was sunk by an American submarine in June 1944. Zuikaku was sunk by American carrier aircraft at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. Yorktown, repaired after Coral Sea and damaged again at Midway, was sunk by a Japanese submarine 4 days after the Battle of Midway. The men who fought the battle are nearly all gone, the last survivors now in their 90s or beyond. But the battle itself remains a subject of study and debate, a turning point whose significance was not apparent to those who lived through it, but became clear only in retrospect. In the end, the Battle of Coral Sea demonstrated a principle that would be validated repeatedly throughout the Pacific War. In carrier warfare, operational capability matters more than simple tonnage equations. Learning matters more than initial advantages. And strategic patience can trump tactical aggression. The Americans lost more tonnage at Coral Sea, but gained more knowledge. They suffered greater immediate losses, but preserved their ability to fight at Midway. They appeared to be defeated, but were actually winning. The Japanese appeared to be victorious, but were actually losing. Not in any dramatic way, but in the slow erosion of advantages that would culminate in defeat 4 months later at Midway and 3 years later in Tokyo Bay. The mathematics that seemed so clear to Commander Watanabe on the morning of May 9, 1942, the equations that showed a Japanese victory were based on the wrong variables. By the time he understood this, the war was already lost, though it would take 3 more years and millions more lives before the final acknowledgement came.